Hello everyone, and welcome to the Microsoft Project Virtual Conference 2016 brought to you by MPUG and Microsoft and the session Effective Use of Project with Scrum presented by Joe Sacco. My name is Jennifer and I'll be the moderator today. This session is eligible for 1 PDU in the technical field of the PMI Talent Triangle, and you can see the activity code on your screen now. It is MPUG 02241614. A recording of this session along with all other conference sessions will be posted to the conference website later today. All of the sessions that you watch live and on demand during the conference will be submitted to your webinar history by the end of the week. Within your history, you can print or download your training transcripts as well as certificates of completion for all of the sessions. Again, these will be available to you by the end of the week. You can access your history by logging on to mpug.com, clicking the My Account button, and clicking on Webinar Reports. If you have any questions during today's presentation, go ahead and send those over to me at any time using the question function on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll do our best to answer those throughout the presentation and at the end if there's time. You can also use the MPUG discussion forum to submit your questions after the session. I'm very happy to welcome today's presenter, Joe Sacco, Senior Consultant at Protivix Business Solutions. And at this time, I'll hand it over to you, Joe, to get started with our presentation.
Thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate it. I want to show my screen real quick here. Make sure you can see that. All right. I think we've got it.
Looks great.
Welcome, everyone. Appreciate it. Jennifer, you can see that, I assume?
Yep, everything looks great. Go ahead.
That's great. Okay. Want to make sure that we get started here. Hold on one second. There we go. Okay. All right, thank you for joining today, and again, the lines will be muted during this presentation. And certainly, like Jennifer said, you can send a question anytime. We're going to spend some time at the end of the presentation on answering those questions. The agenda will be a talk just briefly about me, and then the effective use of Project with Scrum, and then a little Q&A at the end. So myself, I'm a senior consultant at Protivix. I'm a PNP, RMP. I've got about 20 years of experience with Microsoft Project, if you can believe that, and consulting, financial services, manufacturing, and supply chain. I've got 7 years experience, a little over 7 years experience using Scrum and Kanban, acting as a Scrum Master, or sometimes in a hybrid type project where we're using Scrum and somewhat of a waterfall method, sometimes a combination of Scrum and Kanban. The company I work for, Protivix, provides consulting services and training for Microsoft PPM, CRM solutions, and business intelligence. And I'll leave you a way to contact me at the end of this if you have any other questions too. So I wanted to thank everyone for joining. I'm really excited about this webinar today. I know that Agile is a really hot topic, and I commend all of you for joining. I have some important information to share about how to use Microsoft Project to schedule your Scrum projects. As far as industry trends, our experience across a number of industries has shown that most of our customers are adopting or thinking about adopting an Agile methodology like Scrum. For those that have been successful adopting an Agile methodology, they've experienced more rapid project delivery and greater project success rates. Although success using Agile methods is increasing, certainly IT and finance still have some core requirements that need to be met. I like this graph from the Scrum Alliance. It really speaks to the growing popularity of Scrum and the certifications. Notice the exponential growth over the past 5 years on that graph. It's just amazing how many people have joined the Scrum revolution per se and are being certified as Scrum Masters and other certifications that they now have at the Scrum Alliance. This study done a few years ago shows for those that have done a good job of implementing Agile process, certainly project success is up and the failures have declined. So I pulled out a couple of facts from a very comprehensive study published by the Scrum Alliance. These are interesting facts about how successful Scrum projects have been and how it actually affects the happiness of participants, which I found very interesting. Also points to the importance of certifications, as we saw in the last slide too. And as you can see, the majority of respondents indicated that they use Scrum in what might be described as a hybrid approach, so with some other practice. A relatively small percentage are not using any form of Scrum, but instead use another methodology like Kanban, Lean, or XP. The PMO is obviously embracing Agile frameworks like Scrum, and I think that's making a big difference too in the success rates. So why use Microsoft Project for Agile projects like Scrum? Well, I think for those experienced Microsoft Project users, you can certainly leverage the knowledge you have, and that's a big reason. You can also gain unique insights into your project fundamentals like resources, costs, reporting that only Microsoft Project can really provide. Those of you using the Microsoft PPM solution are going to gain additional visibility by using Project. And now, many of you are probably Scrum Masters or studying for that or beyond even and may have a lot of experience, but I'm going to describe just some of the definitions here, just talk through some of them, because there are a number of people that may not be, and I just want to make sure that everybody's on a level setting. So I'm going to actually use these during the demonstration, some of this terminology. So a sprint is a Scrum term for an iteration. The daily Scrum is a short meeting where team members communicate what they did the day before, what they intend to do today, and any impediments to them accomplishing their work. The backlog, or often referred to as the product backlog, refers to all the project requirements. User story is really a unique way to express a requirement. Sprint planning is another Scrum term for what the team does to prepare for a sprint. Sprint review is a Scrum term describing a meeting to review what was created by the team with their customer. And a retrospective is another Scrum term for a meeting to find out what went well, what issues you had, and how the team will adjust for the next sprint. So creating a list of action items and that idea of continuous improvement. All right, our approach, I'll discuss the approach we're using with Microsoft Project to facilitate Scrum sprints. But this same method could be used for any Agile framework that uses iterations, for instance. How the timeline feature can be used to communicate a schedule for a Scrum project. And finally, we'll talk about some reports that can provide you insights into your project. All right, we're going to move over to the demo portion here. All right, you can see that we have a project. Doesn't look like much of a project at this level, but what I'm going to do is kind of break this down. So what we're going to show you during this demo is how the project is structured. We're going to show a detailed iteration. We're going to show how user stories are represented. We're going to show future iterations. We're going to demonstrate how constraints help control the duration of a sprint, and we're going to add a new sprint. And then we're going to talk a little bit about communication, how you communicate your project. So you can see we're actually at level 1. So those of you familiar with the outline function under the view know that this is level 1. And if you look at level 1, it looks pretty waterfall. We have initiation, planning, the build, the closing step. We're 45% complete with the project. We have a couple of phases. This project was actually progressed, so I wanted to let you see that. Again, I started this with a blank template. I'm using Microsoft Project 2016, and the assumption that I'm using is a 4-week sprint, so basically 20 working days here. If you look at the breakdown, though, you can see each phase. We're currently in the build phase, and that should end in May, and then finally we'll end up at the closing phase. So let's go back further into the outline, and let's look at level 2. And if you see level 2, you get to see a lot more detail on your screens. Hopefully you can see that the initiation phase is completed. We've completed the planning phase. There's hidden things still under other summary tasks here, like build backlog. We'll show you that in a minute. If you go to the build phase, though, you can see that we have 3 sprints: sprint 1, sprint 2, sprint 3. We're actively working on sprint 1, and then finally a closing phase. You can also see this little daily scrum, which is a repeating task. Hold on one second. We are going to expand this out again to level 3. And here you see progressively more. So when we built the backlog, we determined the requirements, we created user stories, we prioritized our backlog, and then we did a number of other planning activities. Again, this is an example. You may have 50 more tasks in here for initiation planning than I had. Simply an example. We have milestones at the end of these 2 phases. And then we get into the build phase. And you can see the daily scrum is just a 15-minute meeting with the project team. I'm going to collapse that for now. But you begin to see in more detail in the build phase sprint 1, which is broken up into user story 1 and user story 2. So we're going to take a look at how this one is structured. Let's break this down one more level to the final level, the 4th level. And now you can see the complete details. So sprint 1 is a 20-day sprint, and you can see 120 hours in duration, 50% complete. It starts with, classic Scrum ceremonies like the sprint planning session, and then we decided as a team we were going to do user story 1 and user story 2. So we broke that down into various that fit within our 20 days. One of the things that I wanted to mention is during the sprint planning session, those of you that use Scrum know that you spend part of that planning session selecting the items that you think your team can accomplish, and then the rest of that breaking those down and estimating them. And maybe you're using story points, but then you could convert that into hours and days for Microsoft projects. So that's what we've done here. And you can see that we've completed actually all of user story 1, and we're working on user story 2 right now. So one of the things that I wanted to mention, though, is one of the big challenges you have with Scrum is that you have to deal with iterations or sprints that are of fixed length. And if your project is completely dynamic, as a lot of people do in Microsoft Project with auto scheduling, for instance, in play, you're going to need some way to time box those sprints. So what I wanted to show you was how you can use constraints. And I know constraints are a dirty word in Microsoft Project a lot of times, but not so, not in this case. So let me double click on the sprint planning session. And if I go to the advanced tab, I can see that I have a must start on Monday 2/1. Okay? So I've got a constraint, and this is a hard constraint in Microsoft Project. It doesn't move based on predecessors or successors. If I look at the sprint review, you can see the calendar over here, and with the red dot, that means this is a hard constraint. If I click on that, and I can see it's must start on Friday 2/26. Now that is actually, if I go back to the sprint and I look at the calendar, I can see that that is my 4 weeks. So I started the first day of February, 1, 2, 3, 4. I end on the 26th. Okay, so I've got 20 work days to accomplish what I need to during that sprint. Just to give you an idea how you can time box that. Also, look at the other sprints that we have. If you look, we have sprint 2 and sprint 3. So during the planning phase of this project, we determined that we're going to have at least 3 sprints. So we built this with 3 sprints. Notice there's no detail under user story, just a task of 18 days. So we're taking that first day to do sprint planning, excuse me. And then that last day, we're doing a sprint review, the sprint retrospective, and deploying what we can. So you can see that, and we finally have a milestone. But these are all dependent upon each other, so they flow. Now, one example might be what if we couldn't start sprint 2 on the 29th? Let's say the team had to attend a week-long training. Well, that's really not a problem. You can make an adjustment there. The rest of the sprints will still flow and stay in step. You'll still get the 20 days. You could start it on a different day of the week. So this, again, this is just an example of that. So let's go back to sprint 1 and take a look at this. So I have constraints in place, and one of the things that I'd like to show you is, so how can we try to violate these constraints? And this is the reason we've used them. So let's change the duration of task 98. Let's go to task 98, refactoring, and we're going to change that from 2 to 4 days. So we do that, and I'm going to say, yeah, go ahead and allow the scheduling conflict to take place. So what I see is I've got some over allocations occurring, and we can also see that the constrained task sprint review has not moved, even though refactoring now shows an end date of 2/29/16. And the reason that we're getting some of this over allocation is that developer 2 is also part of the sprint review. And because the sprint review just didn't move, it wasn't simply automatic scheduling with no constraints, it would have just pushed itself on. We now end up with all these red flags, essentially. So if I take that back to 2 days, it removes all those over allocations. We haven't violated the constraint. So that's one reason why a constraint is kind of a powerful tool in time boxing your sprint. Let's say you wanted to insert a task, let's say after 96, and we were going to call that task create executive dashboard, for instance. Okay, and that task, we're going to assign it to developer 1. It's going to be 2 days. And we're going to choose developer 1. And we find out we have an over allocation. And why do we have an over allocation? Because we didn't set the predecessor. So we had to make sure that we set that predecessor correctly to task 95. And then the over allocation goes away. So what we've done is we've squeezed another bit of work and really haven't violated anything. So you can see what's happening is we're ending on the 23rd. The refactoring still ends up with developer 2 doing that on the 25th. The creating the executive dashboard, which I spelled incorrectly. Apologize for that. All right, there we go. Fits in nicely, and really that's the point, that we were able to actually add work into our sprint, and because of the constraint, nothing moved. It fits in there. We had the capacity with developer 1 to do that work. So let's say we wanted to create user report. We're going to reduce that. We were doing well. We're going to reduce that to 1 day. So as you can see, Microsoft Project is telling you, well, with the dependencies that you have in place, you're actually finishing the other task earlier now because it's only taking you 1 day instead of 3 days. And now you're ending, for instance, test user report, or refactoring, excuse me, is the last task before the sprint review, ends on the 23rd, which allows you to actually add more work into your sprint at this point. So you could add additional tasks in there. You have some capacity now to do additional work. And you can see the sprint review did not change. So we've scheduled everybody for that sprint review. It's going to end the last day of the sprint, and it stays in place. And it stays in place because of the constraint. It doesn't have, because it's a hard constraint, the predecessor did not move it up earlier, right? So you might consider other methods. This isn't the only method that you could use, for instance. So you could use a combination of manual scheduling and constraints. I'm going to undo what I just did here. Okay. So let's select the task under user story 2, and we're going to change those to manually scheduled. And now they're all manually scheduled. Now we're going to change the refactoring from 2 to 4 days like we did before. We're going to add more work. And notice we get an error. This action will cause a scheduling conflict. Task 100 has a task constraint or is linked to a task that cannot move. And as a result, the constraint or the link cannot be set. So at this point, it's explicitly telling you, maybe you should cancel this. You don't have enough time in your sprint because you have a sprint in place and you have manually scheduled tasks, and this is how it reacts to that. So I'd say, okay, well, I'm going to cancel that. So you could also exclusively use manually scheduled tasks. So for instance, I can grab these and go all the way through to the end of the sprint under user story 2, and I can manually schedule everything. So then if I change this, let's say we're going to change the refactoring from 2 to 4 days again, and we start to see some errors. What has also happened here that's interesting, we've got some over allocations occurring. That's simply because we've got the work set that way, and we're actually overlapping into some areas. And because they're manually scheduled. Here's the other thing to remember. Because they're manually scheduled, they didn't automatically move. So that's another way that you could deal with this. You also notice that under the sprint review, if I go to the advanced tab, the constraint is gone. And the constraint in essence is removed because we're using manual scheduling. Okay? So there are other approaches that you can use, and I encourage you to look at the ones that work best for you. I mean, for me, I like using the must start on constraint at the beginning of my sprint during the planning session and during the last day under sprint review. To me, that works well because I like to use automatic scheduling. But you can use manual scheduling, you can use combination of the two, whatever really works for you. The idea, though, is that you box these in. And if you notice on the future sprints, I really haven't done anything. I haven't applied those constraints yet because I don't know exactly when I'm going to start those. The nice thing about Microsoft Project 2, though, is once you've built somewhat of a template here to use, you can easily copy these and create another sprint. So we're going to create sprint 4. We'll change the name. We're going to change the name of the milestone at the bottom. And all we have to do now really is to set the dependency on sprint planning to 119. So now we have another 20-day sprint and adjust the depth of it. And there you go. So within about 10 seconds, you're able to create another sprint. So through the process, and those of you that have used Scrum know this, that there are times where you can't complete everything that you selected in a sprint, and you're going to punt things onto the next sprint. Maybe you find that you need to have some kind of regression testing sprint at the very end. Various reasons. Maybe you've just decided that within the budget you have for your project that you need to add another sprint to get the most important work done. So various reasons, but I wanted to show you just how easy it is with Microsoft Project to go ahead and add a sprint. All right, let's talk a little bit about the timeline. So I've got a fairly nice project schedule here. I'm using sprints. I've got my build phase broken up into various sprints. I have the capability to keep adding to this project and progressing it. But I need to communicate it to my management team. So one of the things I want to talk about is the timeline. I believe this was introduced in 2010. I think it's a great feature. It gives you that bird's eye view. For those of you that used it, you've seen this before, but there may be a number of you that haven't seen this. It's simple to use, simple to create. So let's go to the View menu, and we're going to click on Timeline, the checkbox over here under the split view. And you'll see that we've got a timeline showing up above our schedule. So what we want to do is we want to communicate the build phase, because that's where we're actively working at this point. So I'm going to right mouse click on Build. I'm going to go down the context menu and click on Add to Timeline, and you can see it added the build phase. And then I want to go to Sprint 1. I want to add that to the timeline. I also want to add the milestone. I'll show you why here in a second. Show how uniquely it's added to our timeline. Then I want to do the same thing with Sprint 2 to show some future work out here. And I'll do the same thing with Sprint 3. And finally, we'll just add that. We'll just have the 3 sprints showing. So you can see that we even have different colors with the timeline, so that it's really a dynamic representation of your project. So it's nice because as your project changes, so will your timeline. I can hide the timeline again. That doesn't mean the work that I've just put into it goes away. It all stays there. I can modify how the timeline looks. So maybe I want the background color on this to be, let's say I want it to be green, that it's active. So I'm going to make it green. And these are future. Maybe I want them to be this. Maybe the orange is what I'm using, or maybe they'd be gray or another color. But you have the ability to really modify this in a lot of different ways through formatting. I'm not going to go into all those, but one of the things that I really like about the timeline is it's a great way to communicate. So let's say you're meeting with a steering committee once a month and you need to communicate your schedule. Do you really want to show them a 500-task Microsoft Gantt chart schedule? Who's going to read it? But what they will do, they will look at the timeline, and this tells you the story, the things that they want to know. When are you going to be complete? When is the next sprint going to be complete? What are you going to deliver in those? So one of the things that you can do with the timeline that I think is great is you can copy it. So you can copy it for email, you can copy it at the full size that it's showing on the screen, or you can copy it for presentation. In this case, I'm going to do a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to copy it for presentation. And it did it. So if I go over to my PowerPoint, okay. There we go. And I can paste that in. So I hit paste, and there we go. Now I can resize this. I can do other editing that PowerPoint would allow me to do. But this is a great way to communicate to your stakeholders a succinct look at your project in a very easy way. We did this in 30 seconds, building a timeline, and then being able to communicate it through various means. Like again, I could have emailed this. I could have just captured the graphic and put it in anything I wanted. Visio, I could have done it in a number of tools. But I chose, in this case, I'm going to be doing a presentation, and we're going to talk about some of these milestones and what we're going to deliver in Sprint 2 and Sprint 3. But just from a bird's eye view, your management team now knows when you're going to finish. And they have an idea of how things are going, how long the build phase is going to last, for instance. So again, a great feature, definitely worth looking into. If you're not using the timeline right now, I would suggest you do use it. Very powerful feature. All right, let's go back to the project. And again, when you're in scheduling mode, of course, you don't want to see the timeline. So one of the other things I want to talk about just briefly was some of the reports that you have available to you now. If I click on the report tab, let's go to the dashboards. A lot of these reports are new in Project 2013. They have a lot of great capabilities. You can build upon these yourselves. You can create your own custom reports. Again, these can be pasted into PowerPoint and to other tools themselves too, so they're very friendly in that regard. So I want to look at some of the dashboards real quick though. So a lot of Agile projects are using burn down reports and burn down charts. So we have kind of at a project level burn down. You could customize this to use this at each sprint, for instance. And this one's using 3 levels of work, so it's using the remaining cumulative work in blue, it's using the remaining cumulative actual, and it's showing you what the baseline burn down was. So you can see things have changed during the project, but we're still scheduled to end, and you can see we've got a pretty steep line that we're moving ahead. The other thing that's kind of neat about the burn down reports here is that you'll see there's also a task burn down. And that shows the baseline remaining tasks and the remaining tasks in orange here. So how that's progressing. Again, this is really number of tasks that we're doing. Okay, so that's one of the dashboards that is useful. The other one that I like, and one of the reasons why I like using Microsoft Project, is I get visibility into the cost of my project. So the cost of this project is $106,000 and some 40 cents there, or $40, $106.40. The remaining cost is $27,800. We are 38% complete from a cost perspective. You can see the cost status of different phases in the project. So what we're seeing is that the planning phase, we spent actually $56,000. So the majority of our spending was actually in the planning phase, and this chart on the right-hand side indicates that's true. So the actual cost is in orange. Initiation and planning are complete. And we can see on the build phase, we still have some work to do, and we've spent some money on it. But the whole build phase is only projected to be about $30,000. Of course, the closing phase, much less. So nice chart to get an idea. Progress versus cost here, so the cumulative percent complete versus cumulative cost, you get another good chart there to look at. Let's look at the dashboard, another dashboard. So your project overview, and you can see that we have some milestones that are due. The project is 38% complete. We have sprint 1 complete on 2/26. Again, great overview. This is a great report to show to your stakeholders. So you get a good idea what are some late tasks that we have. You can see we have some tasks that we should have finished. The percent complete is 0. They should have finished on 2/16, for instance, 2/19. We've got to get on it. We're behind on those. We can also see this bar chart on the right, upper right, that shows the percent complete. So we can show to our stakeholders that initiation and planning are done. We're 13% complete with the build phase. Another great overview of our project. Let's move on. Upcoming tasks. Again, we can see what we have in the near future. These are usually things that are coming up in the next week or so. Percent of work complete at 72%. So again, gives you a good idea what's coming. These are things that are starting soon. So testing user report, refactoring was supposed to start today. Sprint review. And another great report, especially this one maybe for the project manager more than anyone else in the team. Let's look at the work overview. So from a work perspective, there's a work burn down, there's a work bar chart that's showing the remaining work that we have in a bar chart. You can see the planning's complete, we consumed 800 work hours there. We're showing us, we're due to consume maybe 500 work hours by the time the build is complete. Shows us where we're at. The remaining work is 444. The actual work is 1,156. Good overview of work. We also have some additional charts that you can take advantage of too, where you can actually see some resource stats. So what is the actual work and remaining work by role on your project? Again, pretty valuable from a project manager's perspective. So do I have some people overloaded? Looks like, the product owner and the business analyst are doing the lion's share of the work aside from the project manager. So interesting view of that. All right, so this ends the demonstration piece. Let's go back to the slideshow for a second here. So our recommendations, and one of the reasons I like using Microsoft Project is you're using the knowledge you already have to schedule with a tool that you know so well. And I think this is a big advantage. You're not having to learn another tool. And so that makes there's not that learning curve involved. Really, you're just implementing a strategy within it. And once you did something like what I did, it would be so easy to create a template for your organization. You might take the resources off it. Obviously, you're not going to have the progression there, but once you've built that, you could begin to utilize that over and over again and very easily for a lot of Scrum projects. You can use Microsoft Project Professional or Project Online, if you have Project Server or Project Online, to schedule Agile projects and other project types. And the reason that's important is rarely is your organization 100% Scrum. My experience is that working in different companies is that, yeah, we might be using Scrum or a hybrid of Scrum or Kanban for, let's say, our top 10 strategic projects. But we might have another 50 projects where we don't have dedicated resources, where we're not doing them in an Agile way, that we're using a waterfall method. So we're using one tool to utilize different project management frameworks within our portfolio. So by using Project, you can have all your information in one place, and this makes resource management, prioritization, and capacity planning all possible. It's difficult to do that if you have information for some types of projects in one place and then those in another. And that's the great thing about the Microsoft PPM solution. It allows you to have all the information about your portfolio. It allows your reporting to be complete. And I think that's one of the great things about using Microsoft Project to schedule Scrum projects. So I wanted to thank you for your time today. I'm happy to take a few questions. I'm not sure exactly what time it is. If you have any additional questions for me or comments, you can simply email me at joe.sacco@protivix.com, or you can visit our website for more information about Protivix. And again, I want to thank everyone. I appreciate it. I hope this was useful. Thank you. Do you have any questions? Jennifer, you got any questions? Jennifer, do you have any questions?
Me?
Yeah, Jennifer. Did we get any questions?
Yeah, we do. We have a lot of questions.
Oh, sure.
The first one says, what do you suggest when a user story is not 100% complete? What is your approach to show it?
Well, and I guess to qualify it, it's not complete. A lot of user stories are not super detailed to begin with. So, I mean, my approach would be that during sprint planning, we're digging into the details we need to be able to break that user story down into the tasks. Anything that's unknown, I mean, certainly you can put a guesstimate of what that might be. So, sometimes that I have to do tasks 1, 2, 3. Maybe I have to establish the data architecture. I have to, design the UI. I'm not absolutely sure about every field that's going to be on the first web screen. So, you may have gaps in your knowledge. So you may actually be putting different tasks in there to explode out that user story in more detail as part of your sprint. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality sometimes.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from David, and he asks, since teams are self-organizing, do you recommend using a team resource or individual resource names and assign to tasks?
That's a good question, and I think you can do that either way. So let's say you have a relatively small team, and I would still segment a lot of the tasks by certain. So some of the things that maybe your developers are doing, but you're going to say, well, maybe it's not. Maybe I don't want to tie it to David, but I want David and Jim to work together. Kind of in a paired programming approach. So there's nothing wrong in Microsoft Project in saying, hey, I've got an allocation of both of them working on a task. Or I could name them as part of a team and put them on it too. So there are certain tasks that are done for the team as a whole. Certainly best practices within Microsoft Project are if you can break tasks down into a level of detail that you can make people accountable individually, even though they're going to help each other on a team, which is part of the tenets of Scrum. You can do that. But Microsoft Project has a lot of flexibility in that regard.
Great, thank you. The next question comes from Heather, and she asks, suppose a user story takes too long and the other story in that sprint has to be dropped. How do you show in Microsoft Project and report in Scrum?
Yeah, that's a good point, and that happens all the time. Those of you that have done Scrum know that usually our appetite for work is much greater than our capacity most of the time. So a lot of times, especially on the first couple of sprints, until we understand our velocity, and understand our capability, we tend to bite off more than we can chew. So a lot of times you are going to have to punt user stories, and what that really means from a Microsoft Project standpoint is you're going to take a user story that you had scheduled into the future because let's say you had user story 2 in our example, you can't get to it because user story 1 is taking up much longer. In fact, it's going to take the whole sprint. What you're going to have to do is really copy user story 2 into the next sprint and then change the dates. So you haven't done anything on it because you haven't gone anywhere. Let's say you, maybe this helps too, you got halfway through it, then you're just going to have to punt the task to the next sprint. You haven't completed the user story. You're obviously probably not going to deploy much if you haven't completed the whole user story. But that doesn't mean you weren't able to accomplish something. It just means you're going to punt some things forward, which means you're going to have to move the task from one sprint to the next.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Daniel, and he asks, where is capacity of a resource set, and what do you do when you don't have 100% of that resource programmed into your template due to perhaps that resource being shared?
Yeah, that happens all the time, right? Certainly we'd all love our Scrum team to be all 100% dedicated, but the reality is that's not the case a lot of times. So what we do in Microsoft Project, it depends what tool you're using. So if you're using Microsoft Project Professional on the desktop and you're not using Project Server, and even if you are, you can actually put the percent availability or max units, as they call it in Microsoft Project, and set it at a certain percentage. So let's say that I'm the Scrum Master on Project A and Project B, and so the best I'm going to be able to do is like a 50% allocation. So I just set myself at 50%, and the way Microsoft Project works, it helps you, it understands that only means for a particular week that I might only have 20 hours. So you can do that at the resource sheet, you can do it at an individual task, in Microsoft Project, which is great because that changes over time. You're not always 50%. Some weeks I might be 75%. So I can actually customize that to the sprint that I'm working on and the task that I'm working on. I can also set it at an enterprise level in the resource pool if I have Project Server or Project Online.
Wonderful. A couple of people have asked what version of Project you need to access the reports feature.
Well, a lot of these newer reports came out in Project 2013. So I think that if they have Project 2013, which has been out a while now, they should have access to those dashboards, I believe, that I showed you. Also, I was using Project 2016, but I'm pretty sure those are all available in 2013.
Wonderful. I have a question here from Lilia who asks, do you use any additional tool to maintain the backlog of tasks and to provide the notes to every research and implementation task, like obstacles, progress, discussion points, issues, and risks?
Yeah, that's a good question because, you're not going to show that in Microsoft Project. I mean, Microsoft Project, you're going to show that you spent time creating that backlog, but that isn't where it's stored, and you're going to consume the backlog in your project and create deliverables and, break down user stories into tasks and deliver things for your organization. So where do you store those? I've worked in organizations where we did it on a board, where we actually had cards for our user stories, and those cards had numbers on them that referenced Word documents. I've seen people use other tools where they just use Microsoft Word documents and document all their user stories and the details behind that too. OneNote is a very good tool for those type of things too. So there's a number of tools that you can use, but that is usually outside of Microsoft Project. Certainly you can attach those documents to tasks in Project if you like to do that, but they tend to be fairly dynamic. People that are using Microsoft's PPM solution would often put the requirements type documents, the backlog documents, in Project Server on a project site associated with the project.
Great. I have a question from Alex who asks, how do you convert story points to days?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that is something that you have to understand by doing almost. I don't think there's a simple algorithm that would take story points, because it depends how you calculated story points. If I'm using planning poker and I've decided, okay, this is worth 21, for instance, and how many hours is that? So I would say the way that you have to do that is beginning with somewhat of an educated guess. So in your mind, it's this complex. I think it's going to take 15 hours, let's say. And then you begin to see the relationship. So you could actually track that relationship. You could add a story points column to your project, so you could know what the original estimate is in story points and then what the hours are. So over time, from sprint to sprint, you're going to begin to understand that 10 story points equals 15 hours, let's say. But I think that has to be done through experience, and through trending. I don't think there's an algorithm that'll immediately give you the answer. I would go search for that. I've heard of people trying to do that, but I don't think there's a simple calculation there.
Great, thank you. Ken is asking, how can you have a Microsoft Project account for the number of sprints that are needed to perform all of the tasks in the product backlog to give to the C-level, give a projected finish date?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I've done this before too, is that a lot of times, you're looking at it and you're looking at your backlog and you're really giving in the beginning, it's a fairly rough estimate, especially on a very large project. Let's say I've got a project that's, a minimum of 20,000 hours or something. I've got a rough estimate of that. Maybe I'm implementing a new CRM system or something in my organization. So it's a pretty huge project. I have, a decent-sized Scrum team, 7 or 8 people maybe on it, that large. I've got lots of different stakeholders. So what I'm trying to do is determine how many sprints do I have. I'm probably going to take give you a gross estimate of the total project, and I'm going to look at whatever product backlog I have at that point, and it's really going to be kind of a guess to say, okay, I have a capacity on my team. So you have a team of a certain size, depending on their availability, you're going to say they're available. Let's say I have 4 people and they're 100% available. That's 160 hours a week, and I'm doing a 2-week sprint, so that's 320. I have that 320 hours of capacity. So I'm going to look at my capacity and then divide that into the number of my gross estimate, and I'm going to come up with a kind of a swagger on the number of sprints. I'm certainly going to do more after the first 2 or 3. So I might find out that I need 10 sprints to accomplish this project using 2-week sprints or 4-week sprints based on my capacity. That's how you have to do it in the beginning, I think. It's not easy. It's not 100% accurate by any means.
Great, thank you. Our next question is from Annette, and she is asking, when exporting from TFS into Microsoft Project on a weekly basis, how can I build extra project tasks in? And when doing subsequent exports in Project, how do I retain my added tasks?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I can answer that one. I haven't used TFS a lot, so I would have to probably say I don't know the answer to that. If you'd like to email me that question, though, I'd like to I might be able to do some research and give you a real answer.
Okay, great, thank you. Our next question comes from Patia, and Patia asks, where do you keep your backlog of stories?
Yeah, what we do is on our projects and in the past, we've kept ours on Microsoft Word, usually in our collaboration site, so usually in a SharePoint site. And if you're using Project Server or Project Online, of course you probably commissioned a project site when you created your project, and that's where I would store that, because everybody has access to it on the project team. They all can see the documents, they can see the risks, they can see the issues. That's the power of using Project Server.
Great, thank you. So we also have from Mark, can you do resource capacity planning across concurrent projects?
You certainly can if you're using Project Server. So I would suggest if you want to know more about that, let me know. But you really need to have the view of the portfolio and the commitments of people. So it's one thing to look at a couple of projects and be able to kind of eyeball it and say, well, I've got these people on it. But what Project Server and Project Online allows you to do is to aggregate all that information and to do resource capacity planning and understand whether your people are over allocated or not. And that gives you an idea of the whole portfolio. So you can look at a person across multiple projects and how they're allocated. And that's the best way to do it. In the past, prior to Project Server, people tried to use resource pools and things like that within Project. But that's a difficult thing to do, and not all that successful. I would suggest you look at some of the PPM solutions out there, especially Microsoft's like I said, Project Server has that ability to very easily understand the capacity and the allocation of people.
Wonderful. Richard has our next question, and he's asking, do you recommend using fixed duration for sprints?
I don't think that you need to do that, and I don't think you need to use fixed durations. You could, but a lot of times, sprints are pretty dynamic, and you're changing the hours around, you're changing the estimates a lot. So I don't think it's necessary to do that. I think the thing that you have to be aware of, that even using constraints, you have to make sure that things aren't moving in and out. And yeah, there are things you can do with fixed durations that stop you from going anywhere, but they also kind of limit you to some degree, and they make you do some extra updating. So, I think I would probably not do that, at least by default.
Okay, thank you. Tom has a question. Any comments on using deadlines instead of must-start constraints?
Yeah, deadlines are certainly another approach, and that's a good question, because I didn't want to say that the only way you should do this is with really hard constraints, but what those hard constraints do is they lock things in, and they lock them in for that 20-day period. I was showing you the 4-week sprint. There are other methods that I think you can use to warn you that, hey, you're going beyond where you should have been, or you're approaching something like a deadline. But I would say that the constraints help because they take out the predecessors. So they lock that beginning and end of your sprint in place.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions here. Charlie's asking, can we get updates from Team Foundation server for epics, features, user stories, and tasks? And would you recommend the integration?
Yeah, again, I don't know enough about this to give you an intelligent answer here. And I know that this is a direction that we're going to see in the future, is more integration with TFS. So I would hold on, and there's going to be more and more of this coming, and more seamless integration coming. I don't think it's there yet.
Thank you. And Chris has a question on how does your approach affect CPI and SPI calculations?
I don't think it has any negative effect on those. I think you can still utilize the earned value calculations with my approach. My approach really says, hey, you're not really changing Microsoft projects so much as you are trying to time box work. So I think that you still have that. The thing that you have that's maybe a little bit different with earned value is, and even with baselining to some degree, is the value of those might not be as high as they would be in a waterfall project, because you're not really allocating your people. You're not really being very succinct about what you're going to do next. You're focused on that current sprint, and until you go into the sprint planning for the next one, you really don't have the details. So that's the nature of Scrum. So that your visibility into the future is at a very high level, and it's not very exacting at that point. That's just the way you're doing it. You're doing it one sprint at a time. You're accomplishing work, so you don't have the details of every sprint in front of you. So some of those calculations are only going to work in the current time periods and in the past.
Great, thank you. There are still probably 20 or more questions in the queue here. We only have 2 minutes left, so I'm going to have to cut it short. But those of you who didn't have your questions answered, Joe, can they contact you via the information on the?
Oh yeah, send it to my email address there. Again, it's just joe.sacco@protivix, protivix.com. And I'd be happy to do the best I can to answer your questions. A lot of great questions. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Joe, for your time. Again, this session is eligible for 1 technical PDU with PMI, and the code is MPUG 02241614. I'm going to run a quick poll if everyone wouldn't mind taking a moment to just answer this one quick question here about your experience in the session today. Let us know how you're feeling. And Joe, we thank you so much. Everyone who attended the session today can also view the recording of the session on the conference website, as well as all the other recordings for all the conference sessions. We'll also be sending out a conference desktop guide, including key tips and takeaways from each session. So make sure to update your information on the MPUG account so that we can send that out to you. I'm also going to go ahead and share my screen now so everyone can see that code. Once again, it is MPUG02241614. I thank everyone for attending the session today, and I'm going to chat out a link to our next session, which starts in about 2 minutes, and you can register for that directly with that link if you have not already registered. Thank you again, Joe. Thank you everyone who attended live, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session.
Thanks, Jennifer. Take care.
You as well.